and business resiliency during COVID-19. My name is Ulrike Bargidalia, and I'm the Senior Director for the Digital Economy, Technology and Innovation with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. So thank you everyone for joining. Before I start with the presentation or introduce the topic and the presenter, I would like to thank the company TC Energy, first and foremost, for being a much valued CBRN partner and sponsor, in addition to all the other wonderful partners and sponsors displayed on our slide here. Thank you everybody for your ongoing commitment and support. We at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce greatly appreciate that. Before I introduce the speaker today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about TC Energy in the context of today's webinar. And let me start off with a question, which would be, what sparked TC Energy's agility to mobilize its people to work remotely during COVID-19? The answer is digital innovation. That was the foundation that enabled TC Energy's employees to remain productive, collaborative, and connected in the wake of the pandemic, and I'm sure far beyond the pandemic as well. So when TC Energy leveraged the tools and resources in place to assist its workforce, it enabled the company to adapt and embrace change and new ways of working. And embracing change allows organizations to accomplish things they didn't know they were able to do, or they didn't know that were even possible. I'm sure we've all been there, so this is really fantastic. Because it unlocks a lot of creativity, innovation, and inspiring and motivating people to realize untapped potential and deliver outstanding business outcomes and build business resiliency. So I now would like to introduce the speaker, Chris Forster. I have the great honor to be joined by you today here, Chris. Thank you very much. And Chris, he is the Vice President, Information Service, and also Chief Information Officer. And in his role, Chris is responsible for all information services across TC Energy, but also including critical services such as cybersecurity and digital transformation. And his interest in IT has actually never been about technology itself, which I find truly fascinating. What always has driven his passion are the business outcomes that can be achieved through digital innovation. And since joining TC Energy in 2016, Chris has held a number of progressively senior positions in information services, including Chief Information Security Officer. And his previous experience includes 20 years in various IT leadership roles in various sectors, such as oil and gas, telecommunications, and also education sectors. And during that time, Chris was responsible for IT infrastructure, network architecture, and leading the development of business enablement solutions. So Chris, the floor and screen is all yours. I look forward to your presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I appreciate it very much. You know, one of the things we talk about resilience and change is one of the things I've had to get good at is doing remote presentations like this where you can't see your audience. I am back in downtown Calgary, by the way, and it seems like every time I get an important call, someone decides to do construction on the road outside the office here. So hopefully you can hear me well. Again, appreciate the opportunity. I'll tell you just very briefly about myself. I'm essentially a recovering lawyer. That's the one thing that was missing there. I'm actually quite a nice guy, so all the lawyers don't hold that against me. But I got into IS about 20 years ago, coming to Canada and realizing I had to make a career change. And so what I do today at TC Energy is, very much about trying to connect technology with business outcomes and what we're trying to do. So less about the technology, I'm excited by it, but much more about what we can do. And what I want to talk to you about, today is, exactly this sort of perfect storm of how we manage to use technology to help in a very real situation, which of course, as all of you know, was COVID-19. And so there's the part about mobilizing our workforce, how we did that very, very quickly and seamlessly. But then also, I think some other things that people don't think about a great deal, which was, a lot of the lessons learned. There's a lot of talk about workforce agility and what that means. And that's not really where I'm going to focus today. I want to talk to you about, I think, some of the things that will forever be changed about how we do things in the office. So a little bit first of all about, TC Energy. We're one of the largest energy companies in North America. The reason I like to talk to this slide is it puts some context to why it was important that we kept going. I feel very fortunate that we were a company that was able to keep going and we kept all of our people employed. It's also essential, frankly, for North America that we do that. We've been running, natural gas, liquids pipelines, and power storage facilities for about 65 years that support life across our continent and into Mexico. We have those three business lines of power generation, natural gas, liquids, about 92,600 kilometers of natural gas pipeline, which means that 1 in 4 of the molecules, natural gas molecules delivered in North America, are delivered by us, and 4,900 kilometers of liquids pipelines that connect to oil supplies and refineries in the U.S., Midwest, and on the Gulf Coast. We also own or have interest in 11 power generation facilities, and core values for us: safety, responsibility, collaboration, integrity. And so that's kind of the context and the foundation, along with the fact that we had 7,300 people that we needed to keep working to do all of those things, to make sure gas, cannot go off and stop being supplied, and in the middle of a pandemic like this, the power can't go out. So that was our mission. That's what made it really important to us. And, when I look back on COVID-19, the first thing I'd share with you is I could not have been more remote. I was in New Zealand on March the 13th. When my iPhone lit up, and the company had made the decision on that Friday that by Monday we would all be working from home. And so I had a fascinating introduction to the capabilities of remote work. I was getting up on a different time zone at 5 in the morning so I could connect with my people here. And my first revelation was, this is actually working pretty well. No one could tell where I was. I couldn't tell where they were. And we were dealing with the things we needed to deal with, in a very remote way. So what I want to talk to you about over the next few slides here is, exactly how did we accomplish such a seamless transition? I was struck in one of my early conversations with one of our EVPs. We had a very important project going on in U.S. natural gas, and some very important deadlines coming up. And his comment to me was, how much of a delay are we going to see because of this change? And I was very confident in telling him none. We were working at home, or we were working in the office on Friday. The only difference on Monday is we're now working from people's homes, but we're 100% confident of all the deadlines that we gave you before. And he was a little startled by that, I think, at first, but as they came to understand and see how their own people were working, less surprised and more sort of confident, I think, in the technologies that we had. So how did we do all of this? I would say it started with a solid foundation. And the first thing I want to do here is to acknowledge this was not just about IS. I'm going to talk about technology. I'm going to talk about IS because that's what I'm obviously familiar with. But I want to start by saying it was not at all just about IS. In fact, I'd start by saying we had a fantastic and very well thought out emergency management team. They nag us throughout previous years and throughout previous months to practice getting together what the emergency response protocols would look like, how we would communicate both internally and within our teams. And their diligence in making us do that was a huge part of that running seamlessly. Everyone knew what to do in terms of how to communicate and what our protocols would be. Likewise, our communications teams, our HR teams, I've got to be careful if I mention just a few because I'll forget a bunch of them, but certainly our communications teams did a fantastic job of making sure information got out. Our HR team jumped on it in terms of helping people with policies and everything else, as you'll see through the presentation. So I'm going to talk to you about IS, but I don't want to dismiss the fact that this was far from just the IS show. But on the IS side, it wasn't luck or good fortune that we were able to switch seamlessly to a work from home. We've got some foundations in place that were hugely important. And a big one of those was our Equinex network platform. I had to go ask the smart people all about this because there's a lot of, sort of details to it. And if anyone's really interested in this topic, I can connect you with some folks. But the bottom line for it is a much more robust and simple network backbone that connects more directly to our cloud hubs. It's closer to our offices and to where our people are working, significantly improved bandwidth and simplicity across that network. We reduced our costs significantly by doing this, and that was part of the story, but what it mostly did was give us robustness. And so I can give you, I'm sure all of you are aware, our folks in the southern US, in Houston particularly, and in Texas, are at the moment sadly undergoing a traumatic event with the hurricanes that have been bearing down on the coast there. From a business continuity perspective, I'm able to turn around when I get asked the question, how will this impact us from an IS perspective? And broadly say that it won't, because we've got failovers built in. If one area of network were to go down, then we would simply switch to another one and no one would notice. So that resiliency with COVID-19 was absolutely key. We also had a partnership with Amazon Web Services, which was a new approach to innovation. I'm going to talk later about how we used AWS workspaces for onboarding key parts of our staff, including summer students. But this was much more than a cost reduction play for us. This was about agility. We are now about 90% on AWS. We've got a few legacy applications still to go, but most of our backbone and our servers are there. And yes, it did help us reduce costs, but in times like COVID-19, it's given us significant agility. I can now spin up instances in literally half an hour, give people compute power that they haven't seen before. And I've also got this tool belt of resources. I like to call it kind of my personal Home Depot of tools that I can reach into for solutions like, how do I create a quick app for tracing of field staff, or an app for reporting of status of employees. Became very, very quick in a world where I had AWS at my disposal, and I'm not sending people physically to data centers to rack and stack hardware, which would have been very, very difficult indeed. So a solid foundation was key for this. Again, these are not the things that you can deploy overnight when you have a crisis. They're the things that you have to do in the background before. We also had an interesting experience, interesting journey with Microsoft Teams, something that a lot of companies, just move the slides on you, that a lot of companies, certainly here in Calgary, also embraced, that I was aware of. What was interesting for me was the change management side of Microsoft Teams. And so this was a tool that we had out there for a year. We had about 50% of our workforce using it prior to COVID-19. And then we transitioned the whole company, and you can see in the bottom in the stats there just how significant of a change we made, going from 75 meetings a day, and today we're at 4,500 meetings a day. Very significant change. What was fascinating for me was the ability of an organization to embrace that level of change so very quickly without a lot of change management. And so in the old days, there would have been a sort of 6-month, if not longer, deployment plan where we would have very carefully thought about all kinds of sessions for introducing people to the technology and training them on it and all kinds of other things to get people to embrace it. And never waste a good crisis, because what actually happened was that people saw the tool. If they didn't know how to use it, they asked their colleague next door who pointed out where the button was that they needed, or how to do this, or what the best practices were for sharing your screen. And very, very quickly, the company got to it. And so someone senior in the company at one point was praising IS for this new tool that we had rolled out. And I said, tongue-in-cheek, said, well, it wasn't new. You've always had it. I just couldn't figure out how to get you to use it. Thanks, COVID-19, because you got us there very, very quickly. So, that's one of the stories. I'd say the other big story, and I give huge kudos again to our communications folks for this. As many of you learned during the COVID-19 crisis that we've been in, communication more than ever, especially from senior leadership, was key. And the picture on this slide there is of our CEO, Russ Girling, of course, in case you don't know. And this is Russ. He's actually back in the office during this picture, because it was taken a little later in the chain of events. But what happened very quickly was that Russ started doing town halls with over 6,300 members of our workforce, and seamless. It was like, the comment I heard was, it was like having Russ with me in my living room, because I could carry him around on my laptop and I could sit there and Russ was right in front of me, 8 inches from my face. I could interact and ask questions. If someone had already asked a question, I could upvote it and indicate to Russ that that was my choice for him to answer. And it became very, very engaging in a way that sitting in a hard plastic chair in a convention center somewhere maybe isn't, with thousands of people on your way back. So this was a fascinating experience. It was, again, something that I can tell you the first time we did it, my network teams were very nervous about how the network was going to hold up. And again, it held up very, very well. So this was a significant culture change for the company to do this. And I was struck by Russ recently put out a video to talk about return to the office and what's happening there, and he specifically mentioned Teams and how impressed he was with the capabilities. He did not think it would be as robust and as useful of a tool perhaps at the outset as it turned out to be, and how engaging it was for him to be able to connect with his workforce and his people the way he was able to. And this is something that was embraced by the whole executive leadership team. To this day, many of them do a weekly or bi-weekly all department call where the EVP will give an update and take questions. And if you think about it, something that just wasn't possible previously, that would require travel, booking of rooms, getting everyone together. And so it happens much more infrequently. And so one of the things that's been a huge win is just that level of connectedness has gone up. One of my favorite topics in talking about what we did during COVID-19 and our responses is talking about our summer students. Our initial response, like many companies, was to look at this as something that sadly would probably not be able to survive a crisis like COVID-19. But I was actually very, very proud that we went ahead with it. And so again, our HR partners here deserve a shout out because they really, found ways to think differently about how we could do this. We did a pilot program in IS, welcomed students a month before everyone else, tried to get some of the kinks out in terms of how we onboarded them. And we just had to think a little bit differently and a little bit more creatively. And so we ended up welcoming over 200 students across Canada and the US. We used AWS workspaces because, of course, it's challenging to get hardware out to people in an environment where they're working from home. But what we could do was spin up an AWS workspace that gave them all the functionality of a laptop, all the access to TC and our networks and our productivity tools that they needed without having to deliver them any hardware. And we could just give them their credentials, and day one they were up and running. And so a lot of that was our willingness to try different things, again with our HR partners very heavily involved with us. And something I think hugely important, I have teenagers, they're not quite at that point where they're leaving high school yet and looking for work experience. But if you think about the impacts on this generation that's trying to make their way through graduating high school, colleges, getting work experience, I have a lot of empathy and a lot of passion around trying to help those folks because, while the money is, I'm sure, nice in terms of helping to pay off the student loans and pay for books and college and everything else, the work experience is probably, in my mind, more crucial, and giving them the opportunity to talk about the experience they had. And so we welcomed these students, and we also gave them very meaningful work to do. This was not just, okay, what are we going to do with these people? We welcomed them to teams. In IS, we included them in things like hackathons, where we tried to embrace the fact that they weren't poisoned by the way we do things today, and welcome them to give us feedback on how we might do things very differently from a new perspective. And so it's something I'm very proud of, and our technologies definitely kind of came into their own in being able to do that. It would be remiss of me as the CIO if I didn't talk about cyber safety, because this was one of the biggest concerns that we had as we moved into COVID-19. You've got this unprecedented situation where now everyone is, I'm not looking after 4 office locations or a dozen office locations. I'm looking after essentially 7,000 different office locations with very different parameters for how they work than the office location that's a bit more tied down. And so while we were also rolling out things like Teams and AWS workspaces to keep our workforce productive, we were also thinking about the cybersecurity perspective. And we rolled out a couple of tools almost overnight as part of this. Again, shows you what you can do from a change management perspective when the need arises. One of those was a new virtual private network VPN solution called Global Protect. provided us with a greater security capabilities in terms of protecting traffic between homes and networks and keeping our data secure, and also provided an easier user experience, less logons, less clicks for people trying to work from home. So it made that experience a lot better. We also had something called Defender Advanced Threat Protection, ATP, which is a tool that looks for anomalies, it looks for abnormal behaviors. And so it looks for the person that's metaphorically burrowing a hole in the side of your house, trying to get access to things. So it tells you when things look strange, and gives our security team a great sense of where to go look when there might be problems. So we rolled those tools out very, very quickly. And like a lot of you, we also had to think about how we educated our people on the new realities of working from home. So we started doing cybersecurity podcasts, with lots of information articles, lunch and learn sessions. Again, most of those were things we were doing already. What we did was embrace the fact that, again, you didn't need to book a room or limit yourself to the number of people that you could fit into a lunch and learn session. All of a sudden, if you want to have 7,000 people on a lunch and learn session, well, you can. You can actually have everyone from, instead of flying down to Houston and having a session in Houston, you can have a session for the Houston, Mexico, Charleston, Calgary office, all on the same day. And that's what we did. We also did our first ever cyber attack drill right in the middle of COVID-19, which is I think a great testament to just how much things kept going. It wasn't just surviving through this, it was thriving through this. And our first ever cyber attack drill was actually putting an unrecognized or an unauthorized, if you like, machine out into one of our liquids facilities locations, and testing how quickly we could find it and deal with it. And that exercise went very, very well. And we continue to do things like that from the cybersecurity perspective to test not what we know, but what we don't know, and to really help us to find any gaps that we might have and continue to improve. So all of that happened right in the middle of COVID-19, continuing to make sure, obviously, that our assets and not just our data, but our industrial control systems areas stay very safe during all of this. Lots of other things. Like I said, I wanted to talk to you not just about how we transitioned, because that was an interesting part of it, but I think what many people across the company have realized during this journey, transitioning was one thing, and then there was the experience of actually realizing that some things we started to do, you sort of scratched your head and said, well, why didn't we always do this? Russ with his town halls, not suggesting he won't want to do in-person ones when he can, but there are now opportunities to reach out more frequently to your staff without having all the logistics of booking locations and everything else. So there's a few things that we did to adapt. We had, before COVID, we had a solution cafe, which is our version of a walk-up help center where you can get help with your laptop or your phone or whatever else you wanted. And we had solution cafes in all of our buildings. Of course, those shut with COVID-19. We had no physical presence anymore, and so they went virtual. And that's something that now we realize, well, that probably won't change. We will probably offer the physical locations again when we're back in the office, but we'll continue to offer more virtual presence, more ability to just have a little icon in your Teams window where you're working all day anyway and be able to get help just very quickly by going on the side and clicking there. We've done virtual stakeholder engagement sessions, particularly across Keystone XL, right in the middle of COVID. At the very outset there, we announced that we were going forward with Keystone XL in partnership, in part, with the Alberta government. And there were a lot of stakeholder engagement sessions that we operated virtually and that were very successful in terms of collaboration and everything else. In the IS area, we ran what we call Energize, and I apologize, there's a typo in that one, but it's Energize, which is actually a biannual information services town hall. And I can tell you that in the past, I would travel, so I would go to all of our offices. It was an exhausting week, lots of airports, lots of planes. And one of the things we did was offer up pretty engaging sessions for our staff to learn about things that were going on, bring in outside speakers to talk about technologies, digital, all kinds of topics. And the number one complaint we had from our staff was, well, I couldn't get into the session I wanted to get into, or, well, I had to choose between two sessions that were running at the same time, or I'm in Mexico, and since our Mexico office is a little bit smaller, there was only two options for me to pick from, whereas in Calgary you had 12, 14 different sessions. Well, of course, what happens in a virtual world? Well, there's no limit. There's no limit on geography. I can have the people in Mexico join the same sessions as the people in Calgary, so I can offer them exactly the same sessions. I can record the sessions so that anyone who wasn't able to make it because of a scheduling conflict or they're on vacation, that they can come back and see it. And of course, I can fit as many people in the room as we demonstrated with Russell's events, up to 7,200 people if we wanted to, and probably beyond had we had the need, could all get in the room. And so we're looking at things like that and going, again, why didn't I always do that? Why wasn't that always the solution? And so certainly when things go back to quote unquote normal, I don't think we will change back. In fact, I'm certain we won't. We might still do an element of in-person because we think that personal connection is certainly important. However, for things like this, the remote way of doing this is actually a better experience for many people. During COVID, we launched something called NextTC University. NextTC is our IS tagging for what we're trying to do for the company, and I think the name is sort of self-explanatory, taking us into the new age of digital that's coming. And we launched a development center for our staff who've been asking us, well, how do we gain these new skills? You keep talking about robotic process automation or machine learning, and how do I become recognized as skilled in those areas? And so we're trying to embrace the change of, change can be concerning or scary in some cases, but here's a bunch of tools that you can use to kind of take that change under your wing and benefit from it. So we launched what we call NextTC University, again, really leaning into the remote capabilities to allow everyone to jump in and be a part of that. And then the last one that's noted on this slide is this MCall mobile application, which was in-house innovation. The key thing here being just how quickly we were able to turn that around and how inexpensively we were able to turn it around using things like our AWS platforms and our Microsoft platforms in conjunction with those. So lots of things that we've seen will survive and thrive beyond any return to the office. I always encourage people not to call it return to work, by the way, because people were working just fine and still are working just fine. But as we return to the office, many of these things will survive and will become an important part of how we engage our workforce differently going forward. So where are we today? As I said, previously, we're very fortunate given what we do across our communities. We're very fortunate that our business could continue without essentially seamlessly, without very much interruption at all. Obviously, we realize that we're living in sort of unprecedented times, and very quickly the company wanted people to understand just what an important role that we have to play in that. And so, as I said before, our people, our business remains very healthy. We've released our results and showing a very strong trend of financial stability and strength. And as we go back, we're starting to bring our people back into the office in a slow and phased manner. Safety being obviously paramount in decisions about how we do that. But many of these virtual solutions will continue. I haven't heard officially whether Russ will continue to do virtual town halls, but I get a good sense that he will, and I hope he does, because it's been received extremely positively by all of our staff. So going forward, one of the things that in terms of our culture that we've seen change during COVID-19, one of the things I was very passionate about from the beginning and very grateful for was an increased focus on wellness, and particularly on mental health. I think all of you noticed at the beginning of COVID-19 that there was quite a concern, and rightly so, about how people's mental health would be affected. Working from home, feeling perhaps disconnected, socially isolated in some cases. And one of the things that we realized very quickly was that you had to meet people where they were at, meaning, of course, that everyone's situation was very different. For some people who maybe had the space in their house with a separate office, maybe didn't have distractions like young children around, perhaps it wasn't so difficult. For others, perhaps who lived on their own and who always welcomed the opportunity to get out of the house every day and go into the office, there would be some concerns about how is this going to impact mental health, especially when they're not able to socialize in other ways. And so very early on, our HR teams launched a number of important kind of resources that staff could use, health resources, everything from podcasts, apps on your phone that could help you with well-being and meditation and things like that. And the company culture also embraced really trying to create different ways of connecting people. So I started doing something called virtual office hours, and I still do it, where I, open up my calendar and say, I'll turn on my Teams as if I was just sitting in my office. I'll work away if none of you come, but if you want to jump on and have a chat about anything that's going on, feel free to do so. A lot of our teams did virtual happy hours. That was pretty popular early on. Friday afternoon, we'll bring your favorite drink of any kind, and we'll all just sort of chat like we would in the office. Virtual coffees, virtual breakfasts, lots of those things were encouraged across the company. During our Energized town halls, we encouraged people, in fact, scheduled 30 minutes, had an instructor lead yoga sessions virtually over the screen, encouraging people to stretch and get up and walk around. We've even encouraged our staff where they can, if they're listening into a call, as a lot of you are right now, there's probably nothing wrong with being out, going for a walk, getting some fresh air if that's what you need to do, maybe taking the call on a treadmill if you need to, that kind of thing. As long as it doesn't interfere with what you're doing, nothing wrong with that, and just some simple ways that people could again take care of their wellness and mental health. And as I said before, we learned very quickly that communicating more, empathizing more, trying to lean into some humor was absolutely key. And definitely one of the positive takeaways, as I said before, was just how much connectivity we were able to get, just how much people heard from their senior leaders in ways that they weren't able to before COVID-19. So some pretty significant changes in a positive way there. And what I took away very quickly from this was a leveling of the playing field, by which I mean, so I have staff throughout North America. I have staff in Mexico, I have staff in Houston, I have staff in Charleston and Calgary. I can tell you that before COVID, what would happen very frequently, you'd have a bunch of people in Calgary with a couple of people joining the call from Houston. And it was, having traveled and sat in the Houston offices on the other side of these calls, what you realize very quickly is just what an awful experience that can be for those people. Good luck getting into the conversation when the folks in Calgary or a different office have got very animated and very excited about what they're talking about, and they very quickly forget who's on the screen. And so this leveling of the playing field has been fascinating. My IS leadership team is now all the same. They're all one window on a screen, much like you all are to me now, although your videos are off. Everyone is on the same playing field, and it's been a great leveler. And I've noticed the contributions and the conversation has been significantly elevated by doing that. You're hearing from everybody. Everyone has an equal chance to get into the conversation. Very, very powerful. And that's something that even when we come into the offices, again, will survive. I will not go back to having an in-person leadership meeting because by definition, my people are spread out. This format will work a great deal better. And of course, for the company and for, from a personal perspective too, we're rethinking travel. How much do I have to go down and be in person when we've all got so used to this? And so that's something, that has cost benefits, of course. It also has, benefits for people's, productivity. I used to spend a lot of time in airports, would have impacts, in my personal life to my family in terms of being away sometimes. At times they would prefer I wasn't. And so it's going to have significant, I think, long-term impacts there as well, now that we've learned how well this can work. I think that's just about all I had for you. So, very happy to take any questions. I hope the content was useful, but happy to answer any questions that people have, and I think we're going to facilitate those.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Chris, for the insights and presentation. And you covered such an amazing range of topics as well. You touched upon mental health, cybersecurity, the opportunities everything can create. Let's say when we have challenges, we look at solutions and opportunities, and your company has embraced it through digital innovation, but also through leadership. When I think of innovation, I always think as well of innovative leadership styles and how to embrace it and motivate and encourage and inspires the employees in everybody's company. So in terms of questions, I do have actually a couple as well. I took some note, listening attentively, if I may. And if people, for example, for whatever reason, may have experienced a challenge with Slido, Chris, if you're open to it, there's an opportunity as well to take questions from the floor. So let's see how that goes. And let me perhaps start with one question here that I took note of, which is, what innovative technologies is TC Energy seeing the most potential in, and how are we leveraging some of those technologies already? So if you wouldn't mind commenting on that, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we're looking at an array of technologies. I talked about, AWS being my Home Depot, but I didn't elaborate. So the analogy I like to use is this. When I'm doing a renovation project around my house, which I do less of these days, I think, but I get to the point where I'm doing something and I need a specialized tool, whether it's something to cut tile a certain way or to do something with plumbing a certain way. And so I have to put down everything I'm doing. I have to get in my car. I have to drive to Home Depot. I have to go find the tool. Hopefully it's in stock and I get the right one. And then I come back and I get back in all my old clothes and I use the tool probably for like 15 minutes, and then it goes in my garage, and I probably don't use it ever again, or maybe I do 10 years later. And the reason I use that analogy is, imagine doing a home renovation project with a Home Depot on the side of your house, where you're allowed to go in and borrow any one of those tools, and instead of spending hundreds of dollars at a time, you can pay $1 to have it for the day and then take it back. Well, that's how I view AWS and what it's done for us in terms of innovation across our company. And so what we've done is we've been able to experiment with a lot of technologies very quickly. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of that, because you'll hear it all the time when people talk about innovation. It's about generating ideas, lots of ideas, and weeding them quickly to find out which ones are good and which ones aren't. You can't do that from a technology perspective if you've got to stand up hardware, and that's going to take you 6 weeks to do it. And of course require an investment of millions of dollars. And so I'll give you an example of one of the things that we're doing. We're looking at things like machine learning. We're looking at artificial intelligence. So a couple of examples of what we're doing there. We're looking, in a lot of our places in the US and in Canada, it's very, very hard, as people know right now, to build new assets, new pipelines. That's not particularly easy. And so there's a premium where we've got customers who are clamoring for more capacity on our pipes. And so there's a premium on pipe that's in the ground and being able to use it to its optimum state. And so we're using things like machine learning and artificial intelligence to tell us, using the data, how we can better optimize the pipe and flow more molecules for our customers in the same asset base that we've got. So that's one example of what we're doing. We're also using machine learning and artificial intelligence to help us find information differently and better. And there's a video I love to show of an Amazon distribution center. And it's this massive warehouse that's, football fields, many, many football fields deep. You can't even see the back of it. And the video is just a series of shelves that look like they're flying around on their own, fulfilling orders. In fact, of course, there's robots, little floor robots that look like Roombas that are underneath, and they're moving them all around. And what you see in this video is these almost collisions between these shelves, and the whole thing looks like chaos. Our supply chain VP took one look at the video, and her first question was, well, why is it that the shelves aren't organized? Why aren't they neatly stacked with your Echo Dots and your TVs and your diapers and your whatever else? And the simple answer to the question is because computers don't care where things are. They don't need it orderly stacked up like a human does. And I use that example because it's actually quite groundbreaking when you think about it. When you think about information management, we've all spent the better part of a couple of decades trying to put our information into very neatly stacked packages. It's like, think about your pantry. I want all my spices here, and I want all my pasta over there, and I'm going to be able to find it. Computers and robots simply don't care. In fact, that doesn't make any sense to them, because if you put all your Echo Dots in one place in that distribution center, well, they might all be in the wrong place when you suddenly get a rush on Echo Dots. If you put them everywhere through that space, the computer can come up with an algorithm very quickly to satisfy an order in multiple different ways. And of course, it can optimize it 4,000 records a second type of processing to figure out the best way. And so I use that example again to tell you that that's a bit like our information across TC. Like every company, we've got stacks and stacks of data. The problem is, how can you emancipate it? How can you use it? And tools like AWS can help us do that without spending as much money on things like big information management repositories. Because again, the computer itself does not care as long as you can tell it where it is. It can be in 5,000 different locations and it won't matter. And so to round out the story, we've been using that to find things like pressure test results, where we need to prove to the regulator that the pressure test has been done. We grew by acquisition in the US significantly, and there's a lot of records going back to 1982 that are handwritten on CDs and things like that. And we've had a great deal of success at training a model to recognize the handwriting, to be able to find those records. And every single time we find one, we're able to free up resources to spend on different integrity projects instead of one that might not be necessary. So it's a great win across the board for everyone.
So actually, I mean, while I listened to it, I took more notes, just being very aware, and I find it really interesting, Chris, thanks for sharing that. You talk a lot about actually now tech adoption because you talk about machine learning and AI and how it had provided more efficiency, increased productivity. You talk a lot about data. That's very interesting. I mean, this is a question I actually didn't take note of, but I just, it triggered it. How, in your view, could greater tech adoption then amongst companies, in particular SMEs, be encouraged? Because you're just talking about all these benefits, which is absolutely fascinating. There are benefits to the employees, the organization. I'd like to think your bottom line is an economic benefit as well. I mean, if you wouldn't mind, because tech adoption is, I think, a very important matter and topic.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think the easiest way to talk about that topic is to think about something like safety and integrity, which is our #1 value at TCNG. It's the most important thing every day that we do. And also for our peers in the industry. And to me, there's no competitive advantage in safety and integrity. It's something we need the whole industry to embrace and be good at. And so sharing our learnings with each other, in terms of what technology we're adopting and using, and how we're using it successfully in a field like that, I think is a way that we can, really look at helping each other. So, it may not be that we're all at the same state in understanding how a technology can help. If I have a way of improving safety and integrity by adopting a certain technology at TC, it's in my interest and the industry's interest that we all, figure that out, and that I also learn from others in terms of what they're doing to adopt technologies and how they're using them in their, companies. And so I think that's something we've all got to think about.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I would like to ensure if there are any questions from the floor, and I would need my colleagues with Becca's help here to unmute. And I do see Jennifer Parent has raised her hand. Rebecca, could you please give Jennifer the opportunity to speak?
Certainly, give me one moment. She put her hand down. Jennifer, you're unmuted.
Jennifer, we look forward to hearing from you. Please, you had a question? Well, okay, maybe Jennifer by mistake, or either has no longer a question, or sometimes we do hit these icons mistakenly. Is there perhaps anyone else in the audience who wishes to raise a question and raise the hand accordingly so Rebecca can attend to that? Otherwise, I just look at a couple of other questions that we can address. I don't see any raised hand, but I do have actually a couple more questions that I believe would interest the audience. And cybersecurity, Chris, you had noted in more detail, which is very important, and we hear about it every day, and unfortunately also a lot of breaches in that context, cyber attacks, cyber threats, and how to protect yourself and your employees. Can you give us perhaps a little bit more insight in how cybersecurity plays a role for your company, but as a whole, in terms of security and safety and reliability, and who has the accountability? Is it the user? Are you looking at the technology itself?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and we view cybersecurity as part of our overall commitment to safety. We need to be able to obviously control all the assets, consistently, reliably all the time. That's a big part of it. And so we have significant, investments and programs that help us to do that. We see cybersecurity as everyone's responsibility, and so we put a lot of emphasis on training and everything else. It's dangerous in my mind if everyone thinks just Chris's responsibility and his team, because that's not the reality. The reality is that 93%, I think that was one stat I saw. There's probably different, but it's in that magnitude of these hacks that you're seeing when you open up your favorite news source in the mornings and you see another hack that's gone on. 93%-ish of the time, that's what we call a breach of basic cybersecurity hygiene, and typically that means something like a phishing email, someone going to a malicious website and entering in credentials that are then used to harvest and gain a foothold in someone's organization. And so that's why, those what we call basic cyber hygiene things, starting with, our first line of defense is our people. And so we put a lot of emphasis on training them around, recognizing phishing emails, trying to turn that into a game. We've given people, rewards and recognition, free pizza lunches for the best team each month that recognizes the most phishing attempts and things like that. And of course, we have multi-layered security so that, if, unfortunately, if you're sending out millions of phishing emails, we have to be right millions of times and they only have to be right once. And so you have to have multi-layered security to, for that one time something gets through. But, the analogy I use, a good Canadian analogy, is I want them shooting from their goal line at my goal, or their blue line, not my blue line, when they're trying to take a shot at goal, and keep them as far away as possible. And so that's a big part of what we've tried to do and made it part of our culture.
Yeah, this is a great point, because you are referring to a cybersecurity culture within an organization. I would think that it comes from the leadership and top down, so senior management leading by example, instilling it. And wonderful, I just saw someone else raise their hand. Rebecca, did you catch that person's name by any chance?
Or that person has their own mute on. Anil.
Yes.
There you go.
It's Anil Risbot. I'm also in the energy industry here in Calgary. And Chris, thanks so much for sharing all that information, those insights. I just had a question. I really liked your quote on, never waste a good to accelerate things or to innovate. How do you maintain that now that things are normalizing and eventually we'll get out of this COVID situation? How do you maintain that urgency and that momentum around innovation and curiosity, and to keep that going?
Yeah, I love the question. It's a great question, isn't it? Perhaps you've tapped into one of my secret fears, is that we'll squander this opportunity to keep the momentum going. I don't intend to let that happen. And I would say what all of us have been given who are in this industry is a unique, unintended experiment for the last 6 months to show people what can be different. And so the Microsoft Teams example is a really interesting one to me, because like I said, we only had 50% adoption and 75 meetings a day, and we went up to now 4,500 and 100% adoption, and doing town halls with 7,500 people. And I tongue-in-cheek told you that people said, oh, this new tool you've rolled out is fabulous, and I sort of poked them back and said, well, it's not new. But to your point, how do you keep that sort of velocity going? And that's what I talk to my organization. We need to become a high velocity organization as an IAS department. And the way I intend to do that is relatively simple. I have pretty straightforward conversations where I executive and say, okay, here's the deal. I can give it to you in 6 months and everyone will be happy. They'll all have been trained, and we'll have 100% adoption, and we'll, all these things. Or I can give it to you next week and there'll be a little bit of noise, but you know what, the stock price isn't going to plummet. I'm certainly not going to hurt anybody. And we'll get there much, much quicker. Which one do you want? And if you're happy to do it next week with a little bit more, potential bumps, and part of what I say to them is, if something isn't working well, My team's very responsive. We'll get it turned around and fixed for you in, hours, maybe a day or so, stuff like that. But again, this will not be stuff that hampers your ability to do our core business. So tell me which one you want. And, honestly, when the bumps happen next week, let's all just acknowledge that, that we expected a little bit of that, but the end result of having it done in a week instead of 6 months was worth it. And we've got to do that in changing our culture as well around innovation, being willing to get lots of ideas, hundreds of ideas that we test with what we call low fidelity prototypes, which could be a napkin, like a picture on a whiteboard, something as simple as that, and getting very, very good at saying, you know what, those 99 ideas were good, but they're not the ones we're going for. We're going to go with that one, and give that one a couple more weeks, and maybe you don't go any further than that, or maybe it is the one that ends up being the game changer. That's going to be crucial. That high velocity that we've learned as a kind of an innate skill in COVID, it's going to be keeping that going. But it's actually crucial for innovation in my mind.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris, and thanks for that really fantastic question. That was really a very insightful answer as well, and inspiring. I think I saw the hand of Andrea Buchholz. Andrea, would you like to bring your question forward? Rebecca is
unmuted.
Okay, Andrea, please go ahead. We look forward to hearing from you. Okay, that's all right. Andrea, okay, if you don't have a question or anyone else, I have another one here. I don't see anyone else raising the hand right now, Chris. But as we were moving along, again, listening to everybody's comments and insights, I'm really curious to know, with regards to the workforce of the future, if we talk about tech adoption, momentum, projects, business objectives, the talent, is there any recommendation, like if you recommend to anyone embracing a career or those who are in the workforce, what skill sets do you really need to garner to not only join the workforce, but to upskill and reskill? It's like a constant process at this day and age. Do you have any comments there on the talent and skill side of things?
Yeah, well, again, you've hit on one of my favorite topics. I'll do my best to keep this within the 6 minutes we've got, because I could probably talk all afternoon about this one. When we brought our summer students in, one of the great things that our HR and communications partners did was they created these leadership speaker series for the students to connect them with senior leaders and to talk about careers. And the topic that I had was very much the question you've just asked. What do I do in a world where perhaps some of the students shared with me on the side that it's a little bit intimidating. On the one hand, we think of them as the experts, perhaps, or the people that are learning all about machine learning and AI. On the other, they're quite concerned that the jobs that they might have thought they were going into won't exist. And some of the stats are pretty interesting. The one that hit me was, we're currently training people in school for jobs that don't exist yet, using technologies that haven't been invented yet to solve problems that we don't even know are problems yet. That's kind of the new reality in my mind of the workforce. And I have a 15-year-old boy and a 13-year-old boy. And for me, that's top of mind in trying to give them advice. I've always been a big believer in education and university degrees and things like that. I'm not convinced that I'm as qualified to give them advice anymore as perhaps I would have been 5 years ago. I think that it's going to be much more ambiguous in terms of whether a university degree is what people need, particularly in digital. If I can find someone, I have an example on my team of someone who was a barista in Starbucks 4 years ago, and they are one of the highest impact individuals on my team. What they know and have learned on their own about some of these digital technologies is amazing. And so to answer your question, what do I think the folks need to think about? I encourage them, first of all, not to be overwhelmed and scared by this. I think if you look at the history of humanity, essentially, but especially the last 500 years, we've gone from being an agricultural society to an industrial society to a knowledge-based society to now we're heading into this digital society. And in all cases, humans have continued to be highly relevant, but just in different ways. And so you think about the conversation we had about data. Well, data, the fact that my AWS tools can go find the data doesn't preclude humans. It means that the human, instead of turning up and spending 70% of their day trying to find information and being frustrated, that they can actually turn up with their Starbucks or their favorite coffee at 8 in the morning, and Alexa's already figured out what data they need to look at that day. When you go visit your doctor, you're not going to be happy to be served by a robot. You're still going to want that personal touch of a doctor or a surgeon. But guess what? Your doctor is going to be like a doctor on steroids now. She's going to be able to access machine learning or AI that can see every study, every trial, every drug trial, every research article ever written in the history of humanity, and actually ask that AI, machine, or robot questions about your symptoms and get answers that she may not have thought about before. And so it's going to be fascinating. So again, you'll still have that human touch, but all of the things, whether it's engineering, doctors, anyone else, will be on steroids, if you like, in terms of the capabilities to answer questions. So I think that's the side of it I encourage people to lean into. And just, final comment would be, I've had a lot of people, unfortunately, in Calgary that have been laid off, and they've reached out to me for the kind of advice that you just said. How do I upskill? How do I learn about it? I would encourage people, you don't have to be a machine learning coder. You can be the person that knows how to apply that to business problems. That's going to be a huge part of this digital revolution that I think we're going into, is how do you take those technologies and make them relevant?
Great. Thank you so much. There were 2 more hands raised. I know we have only a minute left. I dare to allow somebody to raise another question briefly. And I noted Raul Meister. I hope I say your name properly. If Rebecca, you could unmute Raul.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks very much for sharing. This has been very interesting to see how TC's IS group has responded. Just a question for you, and maybe a prediction to end looking forward, specifically within the resources and energy sector. How do you feel that the role of the technology function or technology department has forever been changed as a result of COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rahul. I don't know if it's just, I think what COVID has done is accelerate what was already happening. I think COVID has also been a distraction for some companies, and has actually in some cases kind of delayed some of their digital transformations, which is not a word I love, but anyway, but I think that's coming back. I think to answer your question directly, I was talking before COVID about how the IS department of the future, I don't think will exist in its current format, and that's nothing for anyone in IS to be scared about. I think what you're going to see, and what I'm trying to do here at TC, is to blur the lines like they've never been blurred before. I was very proud during one session. I had a series of VPs coming to watch a presentation on our pipeline optimization using machine learning and AI. And after the presentation, one of our VPs came up to me and said, that young man that was presenting, which business unit is he from? I said, he's an IS guy. And he said, no, the guy that's talking about line pack and all that other stuff. I'm like, yeah, he was an IS guy. And he didn't believe me. I think that, to answer your question, is the future. We're going to have citizen development. We're going to be blurring the lines between IS and the business, putting more tools in the hands of the end users, and behaving very differently than the sort of maybe more rigid lines we had in the past. That's my prediction for you.
Great. Chris, do you mind one more question from Francesco? I think Francesco, and that is then indeed the last one. Are you still there, Francesco?
Yes, I'm still here. Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Chris, how are you? Hey,
Good,
just
I
have a question regarding all this innovation and technology adoption. So from my point of view, I think this is not an easy task, but how do you balance the need for innovation, new tech adoption, and the learning curve associated with bringing all this technology to a manageable level once you bring it in mainstream inside the company?
Yeah, it's a great question, Francisco, because, what we're seeing is that, as fast as something becomes relevant, it becomes irrelevant, or maybe not irrelevant, but less important very, very quickly. And it is a challenge that we're having for sure. And when I talked about the next TC University, which is our initial attempt, at least, to take people that may have been doing, similar things for a long time and give them an opportunity to upskill themselves. we're having to get very much more dynamic, I would say, about how we engage and educate our workforce, but not just in IS. And so we're talking about doing things like tech talks, which we now do virtually again to a much broader audience, and get people really sort of connecting much more frequently on what the technologies are, and looking at whether certain people can upskill. I would say to the IS folks, if you're technology savvy already, you're 80% there. Like going off and learning these new technologies is not 0 to 100. It's 80 to 100, right? It's not a complete revolution. And so I think that's the big opportunity in my mind. But it's going to look very different. Whereas we used to go take some courses and it was fairly predictable. It's going to be very fast-paced and changing. People are constantly going to be trying to predict what's next, and we're going to get it wrong a bunch of times. We'll probably invest in the technology that doesn't pan out.
Great. Thank you very much. This brings us now indeed to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much, Chris and TC Energy, and thank you to the audience, to the very engaged audience. I really like when, conversation gets stimulated and inspired and people participate. So thank you, everyone. And thank you very much again, everybody, and Chris and TC Energy. And we hope to see you at one of our upcoming events and webinars. And I wish everybody a wonderful day. Thank you so much again. All the best.